Ready. Good. Kevin, you set? Kenneth? All right. Good morning. As Attorney General, it is my duty to enforce the law. So I am here today to do my duty and explain that law to my one client, the people of Kentucky. I'm not here to give my opinions, discuss my thoughts on fiscal policy, or talk about Kentucky's bond rating. I'm not here to attack anyone or to continue any perceived feud. When a part of state government announces a plan or an action that is prohibited by state law, where the General Assembly has said, you just can't do this, it's my job to speak up. So today, I'm here to discuss a letter that I am sending the governor telling him his newest budget reduction plan his budget reduction action has serious and significant legal problems. One part of his plan may be premature. The other part is flatly prohibited under Kentucky law. So last Friday, the governor announced significant budget reductions in the current fiscal year to what he termed non-exempt expenditures. The governor stated that the reductions were needed for two separate reasons. Number one, he stated that the Consensus Forecasting Group is projecting a $200 million revenue shortfall in the current fiscal year that we are about 2 months into. Second, he stated he wished to add $150 million to the state's rainy day fund. He intends to shortfall and add the $150 million to the rainy day fund. Here are the exact words of the budget director. The goal of this action is to close the $200 million projected shortfall for this fiscal year and reestablish a $150 million balance in the rainy day fund, a total of $350 million. Unquestionable that budget reductions are intended to be used for both. So the Supreme Court has explained that a governor's power to make budget reductions is both narrow and specific. That is because the General Assembly has passed statutes stating that budget reductions can only be made in two circumstances. Number one, an actual revenue shortfall. That's when at the end and close of a fiscal year, the revenue that comes in is less than the expenditures. That happened at the end of the last fiscal year. The second circumstance is where there is a projected revenue shortfall. Once those conditions exist, the governor then must follow the budget reduction plan under the budget bill. Here, it's unquestionable that we are not dealing with an actual shortfall that can't occur until the end of this fiscal year. We're dealing with a projected revenue shortfall. But to qualify under Kentucky law as a projected revenue shortfall, and therefore to allow any budget reductions, Kentucky law requires an, quote, official revenue estimate, end quote, from the Consensus Forecasting Group. That's under KRS 4810. It's the definition of a projected revenue shortfall. There are questions as to whether we have an official revenue estimate. I believe it was the Associated Press that reported last Friday that the Consensus Forecasting Group prediction of a $200 million shortfall is not and will not be official or final until December. If that is accurate, Kentucky law does not allow budget reductions before that time. The law says you simply can't do it. Planning is fine. Advanced warning is good policy. A heads up for what's coming down the road is certainly appreciated. But budget reductions require an official revenue estimate. That may seem restrictive. It may seem like good or bad fiscal policy, but in the end, it's the law as passed by the General Assembly. Not the Attorney General, the General Assembly. For that reason, budget reductions for any $200 million shortfall are premature and unlawful if the Consensus Forecasting Group hasn't finalized an official estimate. The second and larger problem is that Kentucky law is very clear that the governor cannot use budget reductions to move money to the rainy day fund. Such an action is unlawful for several reasons. First, two Kentucky statutes and the Kentucky Supreme Court limit any reductions to the amount of the projected shortfall. Those statutes are 48-130 and 48-600. And they say that the executive branch or any other branch, legislative or judicial, cannot make a budget reduction that is in excess of the projected shortfall. It is expressly prohibited. If those two statutes aren't clear enough, the Kentucky Supreme Court last year in the Beshear v. Bevan case said two things. That budget reductions were only allowed, number one, pursuant to a budget reduction plan, and number two, are limited to the amount of the revenue shortfall. In discussing when the governor can make budget reductions, they said even then the governor is not given free rein. Instead, he may reduce appropriations only in accordance with the budget reduction plan included in the enacted budget branch bill. That's restriction number one. Restriction number two, and no reductions under the plan are permitted in excess of the actual or projected revenue shortfall. Here, the budget director has been very clear that if final, that revenue shortfall is $200 million. KRS 48-130, 600, and the Supreme Court have said you cannot have budget reductions in excess of this amount. In other words, the extra $150 million is expressly prohibited under Kentucky law. Additionally, the law on the Rainy Day Fund allows funding from only two sources. It's in the Rainy Day Fund's statute. Those sources are direct appropriation and a budget surplus. I think based on the letter that's been sent, we know that there's not a budget surplus. They perceive a shortfall. And the appropriation can only be made by the General Assembly. The law on the Rainy Day Fund does not allow funding from budget reductions. So to summarize thus far, if the $200 million projected shortfall is not final, budget reductions cannot start. We do not have an official shortfall as required under Kentucky law. If it is finalized, $200 million is the maximum reduction that is allowed. Regardless, we know that the Rainy Day Fund cannot be included in a plan that relies on budget reductions. Again, you may think that's good or bad fiscal policy. That's not for me to decide. The legislature has expressly prohibited the use of budget reductions for the Rainy Day Fund. The letter from the budget director also raises some additional legal questions that ultimately, as we move forward, we're going to need some clarification on. Earlier, when I said the $200 million shortfall is the maximum of budget reductions, that does not mean that that amount can be borne solely by agency cuts. Once a shortfall is official, the governor has to follow the budget reduction plan passed by the General Assembly. There is no choice. In the letter that came out on Friday, it does not state what steps are being taken under that budget reduction plan. That plan has a couple of steps that have to occur before there can be agency cuts. First, you must apply any surplus funds that are currently in the general fund. We know that there are or were at least some of those funds because the Attorney General's office has returned them. Other areas in state government that generate revenue in different ways would have also deposited them into the general fund. So we don't know how much is there, but it has to be applied. And second, there's at least a step where restricted funds can and should be used, again, to offset some of that amount. So if the $200 million is final, before we get to agency cuts, there has to be an offset for any surplus in the general fund and an offset at least for potential restricted funds to be applied. And at that point, there may be other steps. So before agency cuts come into play, the budget reduction plan mandates that number be lessened. I think there is a question of whether the current budget director has put that into his projections. We have not seen his work, if you will, but that must occur. So as you can see, there are some serious and significant legal issues with the governor's plan. And I want to be clear. I'm not questioning his intentions. I don't disagree that it's nice to have money sitting in an account to help with the bond rating. I'm not suggesting he is right or the General Assembly is wrong based on these restrictions, and let me be clear about that. These are not restrictions that the Attorney General is trying to put on the governor. They are restrictions that were passed by the General Assembly, that had the votes and were passed into law. These are the restrictions on what the governor can or can't do. I'm just applying the law as it was passed by the General Assembly. In the end, the law is the law, and it's my job to enforce it. I'm happy to take any questions.
Do you believe that this is a prudent move, law aside, by the governor to take action early in a fiscal year, and to be sure we balance that?
I'm not questioning his fiscal policy at all. There are just 2 months in to the fiscal year, and I think one of the reasons that you have to have an official estimate is that the consensus forecasting group needs enough time to determine the amount of revenue that will come in during the year. So we'll see as the year goes on. We'll see once that consensus forecasting group projection is final. But I'm not here to question the governor's moves in being prudent or not as to his fiscal policy. I'm here solely to explain what the law allows and doesn't allow.
That's for a follow-up response by September 15th. What's the next step in this process, and is this an issue that you see your office litigating against the government?
Surely we won't have to. So we have a couple of statutes that say you and state government shall not, cannot take certain actions. After seeing this law, surely the budget director and the governor will say, we're bound by the explicit mandate of the General Assembly. You know, every family would like to increase their credit score by having more money in their savings account, but they can't violate the law to do it. It's the same idea here. So it's my hope, because this is early, that we won't have to go to litigation at all, and all that's required is for them to follow the law. They can eventually make, under the budget reduction plan, reductions to state agencies after there's an official shortfall projection, after they've taken the steps under the budget reduction plan and offset some of that amount. But you have to go through the steps that make it legal.
But if they don't do that, are you planning to take this issue to court?
You mean if the legislature has said no budget action shall be taken by any branch in excess of the actual or projected deficit, and they say, well, we are going to go ahead and make a budget reduction in excess of the actual or projected deficit, well, then I wouldn't have any choice.
Is there any statute that says the rainy day fund has to have a certain amount of money?
I'm not aware of that statute, but what I can say is that these two statutes explicitly preclude any budget reductions in excess of the $200 million.
I was wondering if there is that is the case, and they might make the argument, well, that if it's zero, that counts as a deficit because we have to bump it up.
Well, the deficit is determined by the revenues versus the expenditures. I mean, there is a specific formula there for it.
Right. So I understand that your first point is that what he's doing, this plan is premature because the consensus forecasting group is not given an official estimate yet, which will be the trigger for him to make these changes. But I mean, if you look at the letter, I mean, the words that he uses are ask, come up with a plan. You know, I haven't seen an executive order that he's issued. So is he just trying to tell them to prepare for this? Is the objective that?
If they come back and say we understand that you can't make budget reductions until it's official, though I think I read that they said they had to go ahead and start making the belt tightening earlier. I think that's the quote. So what'd they tell you, Adam?
Yeah, they said they had to start making the plans for the belt tightening earlier. But I don't think there's been an order saying you have to do it now.
If they want to come out and say we're asking for plans, we know we can't make the reductions until after it's official. We know that the amount of the official projection has to be offset by the budget reduction plan. Then good. On that side, on the $200 million projected shortfall side, we'd be within the law, and I'd have no objection.
But if they issue an executive order that says we order cuts of 17%, then to you that will be violating the law because it will be over and above.
If they issue an order saying we are making budget reductions to create $350 million without an official estimate, and we're sending $150 million to the rainy day fund, they would have violated 48-130, 48-600, and what the Supreme Court says is the governor's power under the law. Surely, let me just finish. Surely they won't do that because, in addition, I've got to believe that the governor's office isn't fully aware of at least part of this plan, because in their brief in the Beshear v. Bevan case, I think it was on page 31, and it was included in a footnote, the governor's counsel representing him admits that the reductions from universities could never be sent to the Budget Reserve Trust Fund, the Rainy Day Fund. I think in their brief they admit that you can't use budget reductions to fund the Rainy Day Fund. So between this and that previous view of the law, I mean, surely we can, that they will reconsider at least that portion. They'll clarify the first part, and we won't have to go to court. That's certainly my hope.
But what, to follow up on Adam, if this is merely a request, if the budget office and the governor are saying, this is not an order, we've got to take some action here now, we think the best way to go about it is as follows. And would you please cut the following percentage from your agency? Whether you do it or not, they'll have to deal with. But if it's only a request, does that violate the law?
Well, if the request includes this portion, what they intend to use the money for, yes, would violate the law. And so agencies shouldn't have a request out there right now to make budget reductions for a purpose that isn't allowed under law. Even in the planning stage, those agencies need to understand what the maximum amount of cuts they can be asked for, because it's not as easy as looking at all the programs you have and determining what you think is a good program or not. When you go through the budget, there are specific mandates by the legislature that this line item, the Brain Injury Alliance and others, will be funded. You can't just decide through this process that there are certain things the legislature said we had to do that we can't or that we won't. So even a request that includes the rainy day fund piece, I mean, agencies need to know that the number of budget cuts, the amount of budget cuts, state employees that are out there that might be looking at layoffs to the 17.5% cut deserve to know that nearly half of what's being requested can't be reduced under state law.
General, does your office plan to submit to Director Chilton by September 25th a reduction plan?
Well, the Attorney General's office always wants to do its part and will meaningfully participate in any legal budget reduction. What we need to know first is whether or not the plan that's going to be put out there is legal, but certainly if there becomes an official shortfall, if the correct steps are taken under the budget reduction plan, we'll look at it and we will meaningfully participate in some way. But to sit around in the Attorney General's office and to say if the governor is illegally cutting agencies, are we going to participate in illegal cuts? You can't ask the Attorney General to do that, and you shouldn't be asking other agencies to do that. The law says can't do it. The General Assembly has said can't do it.
So you don't know until you see what they do?
All I'm asking for is a legal budget reduction. And if they engage in legal actions, we'll meaningfully participate. I'm committed to meaningfully participate. We need to see what it is. We need to see the amount it is. We need to see our ability to offset it through restricted funds. I mean, 74% of our budget fights violent crime. 74%, of our general fund appropriation fights violent crime. So we're as concerned as everybody else, but in the end, we will meaningfully participate in a legal action. And it's not too much to ask somebody to follow the law and to not do what the General Assembly says you can't do.
General, I just want to clarify one legal
Sure.
point. Can the governor order a constitutional officer to cut his or her office budget, or does that have to be, is this power only extend to being a request? These issues you're raising here today aside.
Right. The governor does not have the power to order cuts in constitutional offices. What I will say is if there is an official forecast, prediction that's made, and the budget reduction plan is followed, we will voluntarily participate in a meaningful way. We'll have to see what eventually it is, because again, if you follow this, if this $200 million becomes official, you still have to subtract any surplus funds. We've returned millions of dollars to the general fund in the last 2 fiscal years. So that portion some portion of that would have to be subtracted. And there are other groups. So you're somewhere below 200 million. Then you have restricted fund transfers. That is a specific step in that budget reduction plan, again, passed by the General Assembly, and that takes something off of that number. And then we'll want to know what expenditures are exempt and non-exempt. We haven't seen that information. Those decisions may or may not be right, but those are the different things we'd want to see.
It's the same question with the judicial branch and legislative branch, same thing, you can't order them, you can just ask, is that right?
I believe that there are reduction plans and circumstances within the law where if there is an overall shortfall that those branches participate in some way. But again, reductions can't be made for at least this $150 million rainy day piece. So another objective of today is, again, to get the law out there. Those other branches, the legislative branch included, needs to know that whatever cuts are coming can include a certain portion.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but based on what you're saying, any participation by your office then wouldn't come till next year sometime, is that correct?
Well, no reductions can be made by the executive branch until that shortfall is official. So no agency can participate. Now they can provide plans, and I'm sure we will be doing planning. I mean, that's just good practice. And to the extent the letter's not written this way, but to the extent that this is a heads up and they come back and say, we just wanted to give you advance warning on this piece, then that's great. I mean, I'd applaud the heads up. It will help us. It'll help us decide how we can participate. Again, I don't want to end up in court over this. I just want them to follow the law. I want agencies to know what their total exposure is. I want state employees that right now I feel a little embattled to know that whatever agency cuts are coming will likely be smaller than what's been put out there because $150 million that's included in the plan can't be. Those are all important things. I want the other branches of government to know that under the law, the ultimate, unless the projection changes, that those ultimate reductions can and should be less.
Sir, what about, I know you touched on state employees, what about the other taxpaying citizens of Kentucky? How are they affected if the governor gets what he wants in the proposed plan? And what is Kentucky's rainy day fund? What is it currently?
I don't know what's in the rainy day fund right now because I believe a significant amount was applied to the last fiscal year. And in addition, when you look through the budget bill, there are different places where if expenditures are above the appropriation, the amount of money the General Assembly has said you can have, the rainy day fund kicks in and provides that funding. There's only one that I can think of for the Attorney General's office right now. If our expert witness budget goes over the budget, the rainy day fund can provide funds. So that'd be a question for the budget office. And again, I'm not questioning their fiscal policy with how much you should have in there and what impacts that it has financially. What I'm saying is the law simply doesn't allow the plan that they're pushing.
And what about the taxpayers? How does it affect the taxpayers?
Well, this could significantly impact taxpayers if we made cuts before the official projection. And the official projection, which if it's in December, may be lower, then we may have made very significant cuts in agencies, in social workers, in areas that people's lives depend on, in senior programs that have already been cut to the bone that may not be necessary. The prosecutors are facing a $16 million current year cut. Those are our Commonwealth and county attorneys. We have county attorneys that only have one part-time receptionist. When they go to court, their office closes. That office that's supposed to be there for the public can't even get in to see them, and because they're the only lawyer, they're always over in court. So I would say that we would unnecessarily threaten public safety if that eventual projection is lower. But I want the taxpayers to know that if they follow the law, and hopefully when they follow the law, we can rebalance that budget. All the mechanisms are there.
Anything else?
What would the impact be on your office if the 17.4% stands up?
It would be significant. Again, 72 to 74% of our budget goes into 72 to 74% of our general fund appropriation goes into branches that fight violent crime, that arrest and prosecute child molesters, that do all of the criminal appeals. across the Commonwealth. And you think about the importance of that. If you lose one search and seizure case, it can impact hundreds of other cases out there. A 17% cut would be on top of what are almost 40% cuts to the office since 2008, and it push us upwards to 60+%. Now, if they go through the appropriate process, if the ultimate reduction is somewhere south of an official projection, after you take the steps, then this office may have flexibility to meaningfully participate and then hopefully have the flexibility to use extra restricted funds, lawsuit settlements or others where we're entitled to keep the money to help support those public safety activities that we do. And my hope is, under a legal plan, that we could still provide the services to the Commonwealth that we currently provide. But that would require a legal plan being followed.
To clarify, what do you think the governor should be doing instead? He shouldn't do this if it's what he's doing is breaking the law. What should he do instead, I guess, to prepare for this?
Well, the governor can certainly send a letter, and governors in the past, saying we believe that we are going to be facing a near $200 million shortfall. That won't become official until December, and receipts that come in may increase or decrease that, but we want you all to start planning. Once it is official, it will trigger the budget reduction plan. Under the budget reduction plan, we'll take a couple steps, including using any surplus funds in the general fund, including using certain restricted funds to offset. After that point, we are going to have to make some agency reductions. Here are the expenditures that we believe are going to be exempt and the reasons why. For the rest of expenditures, this is what we think you may be looking at, and we'd like you to start preparing.
But again, that can't include the rainy day fund aspect.
Correct. It cannot exceed the actual projected shortfall. That's the limitation. So it can't include anything else that anyone might want to do. And this restriction has been on every single governor since these statutes have been passed. And the General Assembly really means it. When they don't just say it once, they say it twice.
One way to replenish your office fund anyway is the lawsuits against the drug manufacturers, and you have that RFP out. What's the status of that?
Well, let me say that it's not that simple, because we have spending caps in Kentucky on everything. So I have a total spending cap on restricted funds. So if we have even cost of litigation that comes in, we're still limited in how much of that we can use without working with the budget office to increase that. Now, they've been good about that. We've had a good working relationship. When we got that grant, first ever Department of Justice grant to fight human trafficking, they increased that number. But there are some technicalities there. You can't, as an agency, just use those without getting a change. The RFP, we are close. I believe that there will be an award likely in the next couple weeks. I have not participated in the scoring or in the negotiations. I will have personally had no part in selecting the ultimate winner of that. And I think that's how it should be.
I want to be clear about Adam's question about what the governor, could do. And you were saying if there's an official forecast of the consensus forecasting group in December.
Right.
Okay, but the second, on page 2, the second paragraph says an actual revenue shortfall cannot occur until the end of the fiscal year.
So there's two ways you can trigger the budget reduction plan. Number one, actual, or number two, projected.
Okay.
So actual can only occur at the end of the year, and that's what they did last year. And from what I've seen from that, it was legal. And I think if you look at the executive order, they talk about the budget reduction plan and the steps that they're taking under it. I don't have any issue with that, and we participated meaningfully in it. It shows that we will participate in a legal budget reduction. The second instance is an official estimate of a projected shortfall. So the statute says actual or projected, and then Chapter 48 defines projected as requiring it to be official.
Could the governor or could Consensus Forecasting Group reschedule, have a meeting September 25 and do what it's planning to do in December and make it official at this point?
I'd have to review if there are any rules or regulations on that, but once they make it official, it will be official. Now, there's a question of, will a group of economists, want to make that type of prediction a month and a half to 2 months in, we'll leave it to them. They're the professionals. Because once this money has been reduced, there's no obligation if revenues pick back up to replenish it, even to very important funds. That's why there are all these laws that restrict when it can happen and how.
How old are those laws? Do you know what-
I'd have to look at the data passage. I mean, they've certainly been in law as long as I've been Attorney General, and the Supreme Court had a big discussion about them and how they interact with the budget. These are the permanent laws. These will govern any budget that's out there. And then the budget itself, we haven't gotten into this, may have restrictions about whether funds that are appropriated to one place can then be basically reappropriated, which is the attempt through reductions, to a separate place, the Budget Reserve Trust Fund. That may have separation of powers issues. It may have the budget bill itself. But these are so clear in the fact that you can't do it, I don't think we ever reach that. All right?
Thank you all.
Thank you all very much.